really struggled this week with deciding which thesis statement I would use for my video, but I think I've decided that Griswold, Roe, and Casey were all correctly decided by the court. I have a few clarifying statements I'd like to make about each, but I'll start with Griswold versus Connecticut. So this case involved a Connecticut law that prohibited the use of contraceptions, and in conjunction with another law, made Planned Parenthood culpable for providing information about contraceptives to married couples. The majority opinion, which was authored by Justice Douglas, really focused on the idea of a fundamental right to privacy. Even though the court acknowledged that the Constitution doesn't ever expressly state that there is a right to privacy, it asserted that the Bill of Rights has a penumbra which creates a zone of privacy as a peripheral right. I think that Griswold versus Connecticut correctly established a right to privacy, and that overall the holding of Griswold was correct. Moving on to Roe versus Wade, which focused on a Texas law that put restrictions on abortions, I think that the court correctly relied on Griswold and the right to privacy, the right to privacy which was defined by Griswold, and that I think that Roe versus Wade correctly extended that right to privacy to include privacy revolving around decisions about procreation, and specifically decisions about whether to terminate or to take to term a pregnancy. One thing that I think is really important that the court does is that they correctly identify that a state really has two legitimate interests in protecting or restricting abortions. The first is that the state has a legitimate interest in protecting a mother's health, and the second is that the state has a legitimate interest in protecting a potential for human life in the fetus. I do disagree with the court in their breakdown of the trimester as a standard for when to apply restrictions to abortion. For starters, I think that the state's interest in protecting the mother's health is always a compelling interest. I don't think that changes based on the trimester of pregnancy. Second of all, I agree with the court that the state's interest in protecting the potential for human life really only becomes a compelling interest after that fetus is viable. So I don't see a need for the breakdown by trimester. So essentially what the court is saying, and I agree, is that if a fetus is not viable, then a mother gets full discretion to discern whether she wants to sacrifice her health, her well-being, and potentially even her life to bring a fetus to full term. I should say that she has that discretion in corresponding with a physician. But if a fetus is viable, then the state has a legitimate interest in protecting that right to potential life so long as it doesn't detrimentally impact the woman's health. So moving on to Planned Parenthood versus Casey, essentially that case reaffirmed Roe, and I definitely agree with that. I think that that was a necessary step for the court at that time. I also agree with the court in which aspects of the law that they upheld and which ones they struck down. One thing that I found interesting about Planned Parenthood versus Casey was Justice Blackmun's concurrence in part, so it wasn't actually a part of the majority opinion. But he wrote that the dramatic impact that motherhood has on a woman's educational prospects, her employment opportunities, and her self-determination are so great that restrictive abortion laws deprive her of a basic control of her own life. He kind of equated motherhood to some kind of involuntary servitude at the government's request. And he specifically argued that this deprivation triggers the Equal Protection Clause. I will say that I disagree with him on that. I think that just because pregnancy is specifically a woman's issue doesn't necessarily make it an inequality issue. I think more so those impacts on a woman speak more to her liberty and her right to liberty. And that's why the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment is a more appropriate avenue of dealing with abortion issues, because abortion issues so greatly detract from a woman's liberty if she were to be forced to carry to term an unwanted pregnancy. So overall, I agree with the court's findings in Griswold, in Roe versus Wade, and in Planned Parenthood versus Casey.